You are listening to Radio Free Humanity, the Marxist-Humanist podcast. My name is Brendan Cooney.
And I'm Andrew Kleiman.
On today's episode, Andrew and I discuss Lenin's State and Revolution. And in the current events section, we're going to talk about the district attorney race in Philadelphia. To hear more episodes of Radio Free Humanity, to read more about the issues discussed, or to join in the conversation, please visit Marxist-Humanist-Initiative.org. You can also make a donation to the podcast there on the website. While our podcast is hosted by MHI, the views expressed by the co-hosts and guests of Radio Free Humanity are their own. They do not necessarily reflect the views and positions of MHI. So we're recording this current event section on May 24th. Last week, we were recording this main segment about state and revolution, and on the topic of political determinism and the belief that changing individuals in power can fundamentally change things, we got to talking about the recent district attorney election here in Philadelphia for progressive district attorney Larry Krasner. And after we recorded the episode, Andrew and I thought that would actually be a good topic to talk about for the current events section as well. Earlier in May, just a week ago, Philadelphia had its primary elections, and the incumbent district attorney, Larry Krasner, who is a sort of celebrated progressive district attorney who has promised to change a lot of things about mass incarceration in the city of Philadelphia, and has become somewhat of a national figure as well, and sort of encouraged a movement of progressives to run district attorney candidates in different cities. He was up for a re-election, and the powers that be, the police union, the Fraternal Order of Police, and other forces in the city who were not happy about his politics, ran a campaign against him, ran a primary challenge against him. They selected a man, Carlos Vega, who would have been the first Latino district attorney in Philadelphia, and ran him as a Democratic primary challenge.
Let me just ask, so we'll bring everybody up to speed here who don't know Philly politics. So a progressive wins the Democratic primary for district attorney in Philadelphia. Why is it such a big deal that a progressive wins the Democratic primary? There's also a general election coming up later.
Right. Well, in Philadelphia, it's like, I think Democrats outnumber Republicans like 7-1 or something like that. So if you win the Democratic primary, you pretty much are a shoo-in to win the general election.
Okay, let me ask another question. The Fraternal Order of Police backed an opposition candidate, and that lost. How big a deal is that the Fraternal Order of Police didn't get its way?
That's a really big deal. Traditionally, district attorneys court the endorsement of the Fraternal Order of Police. Larry Krasner made an enemy of the FOP when he ran 4 years ago, and he's continued to have quite an abrasive relationship with the police department over the 4 years he's been district attorney. So the FOP really went all out. There was a political action committee that got over for like $100,000 from the police union. They ran all sorts of ads. The Fraternal Order of Police, they ran ads encouraging Republicans to switch party affiliation to vote Democrat so they could unseat Krasner. And I think if this hadn't been in the era of the Black Lives Matter movement, if this had been 10 years ago, there's no way that someone could have defeated the FOP in that sort of climate. But what happened is that Krasner, not only did he win his re-election, but he won by a landslide, like a total landslide. So even though the FOP brought out other guns, so to speak, spent a lot of money, people are writing their political obituary now in Philadelphia and saying that the era of their sort of unchecked political influence may be over.
And how far back does that political influence go?
I'm not a historian of Philadelphia and police, but Philly, is known for having a very violent and racist police force going back decades. We're the only city to have dropped a bomb on its own people. That was the Move bombing, where the city torched an entire block in a battle with black nationalist activists. Frank Rizzo, the former police commander and also former mayor of Philadelphia, was often is referred to as like a predecessor of Trump, and he was a very popular politician in Philly back in the day. There's a city of Mumia, Abu Jamal,
who's always been very close to Move, the people that they dropped the bomb on.
Yeah. So there's a real history of racism in the Philly Police Department, and not just in recent years, but going back for decades. The police union have not shied from criticizing Krasner all along. There was even an incident a couple years ago where after a policeman was shot and they tried to sort of blame Krasner for it and formed a barricade linking arms and wouldn't let him into a building. And that made a lot of news.
Yeah, this is something that happens. It's not particular to Philly. It happens in cities across the United States. The so-called police unions have a lot of political power. They manage to get people elected to them that are friendly to them. And when they don't, they engage in these actions, strikes, slowdowns on the job, and they basically tie the hands of elected officials and force them to do the bidding of the police union. That's happened in New York with our current now outgoing mayor was supposedly a progressive, and he just learned that he had to do what the police union wanted.
Yeah. So this is pretty remarkable. I mean, Krasner has done a lot of things to anger the status quo in Philly, and not that activists have any illusions that this is like a panacea. And there are a lot of criticisms from some of the left that, his promises are really constrained by his position as he's still the district attorney, right? So as to prosecute criminals. But he's done a lot of things to really anchor the police. He fired like 31, I think, prosecutors when he first took office, including Vega, his primary opponent. But he has like a police accountability unit, and they keep a list of police officers who they won't use for testimony in court because they're considered not reliable witnesses, having lied in the past. He's overturned wrongful convictions. He's refused to prosecute low-level drug possession and prostitution. He's ended cash bail for a lot of instances, although not totally. But the police, I think, really thought that they could use their old tactics. They ran a law and order campaign. Gun violence is really bad in Philadelphia and has been increasing every year for a while now. And during the pandemic, it really exploded. And people everywhere in the city are very concerned about gun violence, right? So the narrative was, look, he's letting criminals off. He's not making people afraid of the law. And so you got to get rid of this guy for our own good. And that was the campaign they ran. Very traditional law and order campaign. And it just failed. No one bought into it.
He won by about a 30-point margin over Vega.
Yeah.
What contributed to this victory? You mentioned the atmosphere of Black Lives Matter.
Yeah.
But is there anything else going on? Black people voting for him?
Yeah. I mean,
what percentage of the Philadelphia population is black?
Philadelphia is 44% black, 35% white, 13% Latino, 7% Asian.
Right. And one would suppose that, Democratic voters, people voting in the Democratic primary are even more disproportionately black. So,
right.
Probably just if we don't know detailed statistics of who voted how, it would probably stand to reason that Krasner could win just on the strength of the black vote.
Yeah, assuming things about voter turnout.
Right.
But voter turnout was very high in this primary, which is unusual for a primary. I think a lot of people just know that you can't blame the district attorney for crime. They know that this has been going on since before Larry Krasner took office. And so those arguments just don't work on people. That was one reason. Vega really tried to make himself look like a progressive. He was running I'm going to be a progressive, just like Larry Krasner, but I'm also going to do something about crime. But I don't think people bought it. They realized it was disingenuous. People made a lot about the fact that the FOP in Philly a year or two ago were fraternizing with members of the Proud Boys at a social event. There were these Proud Boys with Proud Boy T-shirts and stuff on at some FOP social event, and they were hanging out with the Proud Boys, and that made headlines. And when that happened, Krasner released a statement criticizing them. And that really stuck. I mean, I heard Vega on the radio the week before the election being interviewed on the NPR station locally. And the interviewer, Marty Moskowayne, straight up just asked him, and she said, "You're endorsed by the FOP, and they were hanging out with the Proud Boys last year. What do you think about that?" And he had to be on the spot and answer that. The FOP endorsement really hurt his candidacy. Some people I've seen writing that, if he just ran without the FOP endorsement, he probably would have done better.
I tell you, for somebody who was born in Philadelphia and has known about it over the decades, to me this is like amazing that
Yeah.
uh, that it's not just like the FOP doesn't get its way, but that it's a positive hindrance on somebody's candidacy.
Yeah.
And that might be a matter of a new level of Black consciousness, people feeling either that they have to stand up and fight, or energized by the recent successes of the movement for Black lives. How much of it is, a progressive turn in the white population and the Latino and other populations? I know that nobody knows, but what's your sense?
Well, if you look at the wards where Krasner won over Vega, I mean, all the predominantly black neighborhoods, Krasner won by a landslide. Krasner also won in the white neighborhoods that are more liberal white neighborhoods, Center City, West Philadelphia, Northwest Philly. I mean, those still have large black populations too, but they're maybe a little more majority white wards. Those wards all went heavily for Krasner. Those are like your progressive white wards. And then the parts of the city that are sort of like the old Italian, South Philly neighborhoods, Kensington, which is like a poor white neighborhood, the upper Northeast, those places went for Vega. So, there's really like a split in white people in Philadelphia, as there is everywhere in the country, right? Well, that's all the time we have for this current event section. Up next, Andrew and I discuss state and revolution. For this main segment, we're going to be talking about State and Revolution by Lenin. Well, Andrew, it was your idea to talk about this today. So what were your main reasons?
Well, I think it's one of the most important works in Marxism. One of the prime contributions by Marxists after Marx. That doesn't mean I, agree with every aspect of it. I don't agree with every aspect of it, but I think it's path breaking in some ways. It's a very serious engagement with Marxist thought and Lenin's thought, but the impetus, why I suggested talking about it right now is somebody wrote to me about this book by a council communist that was published, oh my God, 90 years ago or so, Jan Appel, talking about basically the economy under a council communist understanding of the new society. So, somebody asked me about Jan Appel's book, which evidently has come out in a new edition. And my thinking is that I think what Apple did was extremely insufficient, wrong-headed, and that despite all of his disagreements with Bolshevism and so forth, the main insufficiencies in Apple's work flow from certain things in his conception that he shared with Lenin and the Bolsheviks and most of the people in the Second International who thought about economic questions. So it's like they disagree with one another, but they're kind of opposite sides of the same coin. And I think the coin is what's problematic. So rather than just discuss Apple, I think it's important to go back to looking at what was this conception of the capitalist economy, of an economy, how that relates to state management. Because my view is that there's just way too much political determinism, whatever side you take. There's way too much political determinism in all of their conceptions, and that goes back even into a certain understanding of how the capitalist economy works, which I think, is a wrong-headed way of understanding it.
Right. So hopefully we'll get into those details as we sort of talk through State and Revolution. But
it's like a counterpart to economic determinism, where the economic factors are in the driver's seat and they determine or set what the outcome is.
right. But you say there's too much political determinism in the sense that they think that the politics can determine the economic structure of society?
Yeah.
Okay.
Basically, you make decisions and you implement them, and that's it. To use Chairman Mao's famous phrase, politics and command, the idea that you can command an economy by means of political decisions that you implement. So the whole set of issues then becomes who's making the decisions, what are their priorities. When we talk about a capitalist economy like that, it's very obvious what the problem is. Capitalist economies have their own economic laws, and despite the intentions of policymakers, those laws of capitalist production assert themselves, and if you do something contrary to the law, that ends up hurting you. There are unintended consequences. This is something that the right wing continually says, and the social democrats and the reformists try to scoff at that and sweep the problems under the rug. But it happens to be correct. I mean, as long as you've got an economy oriented to the production of value, and you try to make things better for the workers by paying them more and improving working conditions and cutting working time, well, all that stuff is costly, and the consumers don't want to pay the higher costs. So what you're basically doing is telling people to go out of business. And within the laws of capitalism, those are the alternatives. You either cut costs, work the workers to the maximum, and are able to produce stuff competitively, or you go the opposite way and the company goes out of business. So that's what I mean by the laws of capitalist production being in command and overriding, asserting themselves despite good intentions and the priorities of the decision makers and who's making the decisions and the forms of decision making. So that's the problem with the political determinism.
Well, why don't we get into some of the main arguments of State and Revolution, and then maybe it'll become clear to listeners how this sort of political determinism is present and what Lenin's talking about.
Yeah. So how would you characterize the main theme and the main argument?
Everything seems to flow from Lenin's argument that the state as we know it is a monopoly on the use of force in a class society. It's something which the ruling class uses to keep itself in power, regardless of what kind of class society it is.
Right. So it's not just that it's a monopoly of force, but the whole shtick of the state is that it uses the force to keep the power of the one class by suppressing the power of the other class.
Right. So it's like an instrument of the ruling class to maintain its power
over the other class, right?
Over the other class,
classes,
right?
Yeah. People seem to sometimes think that this is like limited to breaking up demonstrations and like infiltrating the left or whatever it is, but it happens on a daily basis even without any explicit violence.
Right.
I mean, there are laws that say you can't just take stuff, and there are consequences if you do. So basically, there are laws that say that the proletariat is at the mercy of the bourgeoisie.
And there's a whole bureaucratic framework and regulations that structure all the social interactions so that the machinery of capitalism continues to function on a day-to-day basis.
Like what? I think I know what you mean.
Regulations of industrial relations, regulations about how capitalists relate to each other, infrastructure, controlling the money supply so that trade moves smoothly, ensuring banks deposits, just all the basic things that are the framework of the economy are coordinated in many ways through the state.
Yeah.
So, so Lenin talks about like the state having a monopoly on violence, but he also talks about the bureaucratic machinery of the state.
Right.
So the argument is that this is not like a neutral political form, but is something that is specific to class society, and that the state we have in a capitalist society is a specifically capitalist kind of state. And so the role of socialists or communists is to seize the state and use that power to suppress the power of the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class. And then once a new mode of production, socialist or communist mode of production is established, the state will wither away because there's no longer a need for the suppression of one class over the other.
The way you put it, because you're missing one piece of it. I think this is the conception that Lenin is concerned to combat here. Because of one element that you didn't mention. Maybe you're about to mention it.
Right, because the state is not neutral. It can't just be taken over. It has to be broken, crushed, transformed into something radically new on the basis of a new mode of production.
So, I think a lot of people have heard the term smash the state. Well, smash is, that's an alternative translation of the conception of Marx that Lenin is recovering here. I mean, he's not just recovering it, he's trying to work it out and make it concrete in terms of how this can work. And he got an opportunity to at least try to put this into operation shortly after finishing the finished part of the pamphlet.
And he's also directly engaging with what he sees as like a bastardization of Marx's ideas about the state by the Social Democrats,
right,
and the European Social Democratic parties.
Right, and also, he's in Russia in 1917, prior to the Bolshevik Revolution, the October Revolution. They'd already had the February Revolution, so he's dealing with, kind of like a reformist or social democratic government there in Russia, and what it's doing and what it's not doing. And this whole theory that the state is some sort of neutral mechanism that mediates between different classes and is kind of like over and above the contending forces in society. That's what he's dealing with, and it's very detrimental to people's thinking, because it's among the things that's leading people to accept just like different people in charge of the same state apparatus, and not, smashing the state power and moving forward. Let me say something. I think what Lenin does that's very innovative is to bring together the general writings about the theory of the state put forward by Marx, and basically I think it's the same theory put forward by Engels, and he brings that together with what Marx wrote about the Paris Commune. And Marx also drew the connection. I mean, after the experience of the Commune, Marx says, look, since 1852, I've said that the power of the state has to be broken, or smashed. And therefore, like in the Communist Manifesto, he and Engels put a little, introductory note and said, some of this stuff that we wrote in 1848, the subsequent development of capitalism has made it such that this is outmoded. The things where you take this over and that, and he says the power of the state has to be broken. Okay, so I think a lot of the really innovative part of the State and Revolution by Lenin is to bring all of this together and then to say concretely, what does it mean to break the state power, because there are still administrative functions, and what he's dealing with is not communism, the lower phase of communism, even what they call socialism. What he's dealing with is you have a political change in power. Okay, what gets done with respect to the state? Or do you just take it over? No, you don't just take it over. What has to happen is that the administration of public affairs has to be in the hands of the people, and they have to be armed. And here's how you do it. And here's how you do it with people who've got no prior training in administration, no management degrees, no political experience, in terms of that kind of politics. Here's how you draw the populace as a whole into managing its own affairs. This is what breaks the power of the state, the special bureaucracy, and so forth. I think that it's very good stuff when applied to the issues of the state, not applied to the issues of the economy. The short version of this is something that C.L.R. James coined a phrase that actually doesn't come from Lenin, but it comes from it's a summary of something he wrote, not in the State and Revolution, but shortly thereafter. Every cook shall govern. So that's the idea is, and that evidently what was meant by cook is he used the term for a woman who cooks. So this is like lowly female cook. We're not talking about the top chefs here. So this is the idea is here is how you break the state as a repressive apparatus over the people, okay, and prepare the ground for socialism is you bring the people themselves into managing their own political affairs. It's not a hard idea, but I don't think it had been articulated before. Except that it's there when Marx is commenting on the experience of the commune.
I think Lenin does a good job of bringing out Marx's method there and how, Marx really let his thinking evolve based on the experience of the commune. It was like the first experience of a political form that could smash the power of the bourgeois state. And he drew from that example to start to think about what that would mean in real terms. And Lenin has a good discussion of that in the text. Lenin has a lot to say about the state as an instrument of violence, the police, the standing army. What lessons, if any, can we draw from this discussion about the struggle for black lives in the U.S. today, the struggle over police brutality, defunding the police, and so on? Yeah, it's funny. I was just thinking about that as you were talking a minute ago.
What?
I was thinking about, here in Philadelphia, we just had a big election for the district attorney. We have this progressive district attorney who has been doing a lot to try to dismantle some of the repressive apparatus of incarceration in the city, and has done a lot of really good things. And he was elected in 2017, Larry Krasner. He was up for re-election this year. So the Fraternal Order of Police funded a primary challenge against him. And so Krasner, the DA, won, and the police-backed candidate lost by like a landslide just 2 days ago. So anyway, people in the city are thinking, it's all in the zeitgeist right now. People are thinking about reform of the institutions of policing and criminal justice. But I was just thinking as you were talking about how limited, even you have like the right guy in charge of the DA's office, right? You couldn't ask for a better progressive DA. The guy's he's a civil rights lawyer who's like sued the police like 40 times or something in his career. But still, the real problems of like policing and incarceration are not solved right now in Philadelphia.
Right. We're going through the same thing in New York City right now. We have an election coming up, and among the positions being voted on is the district attorney, and there's like a lot in the Democratic primary. There's like 8 or 9, 10 candidates, and the public defenders organization. The lawyers who defend indigent people who have no other lawyers. They're like, well, we're not going to endorse anybody because basically the whole apparatus of district attorney, it's a repressive institution, but here are the candidates who will do more harm, and here are the candidates who will do the least harm and understand what it is to do harm. And at the top of the list, there are 2 candidates in particular, and one of them is herself a public defender, Eliza Orlins, and I just got a brochure in the mail, and she's got a picture of herself holding up a sign, probably at a BLM demonstration last year, a little handmade sign saying the system isn't broken. It's been working the way it's supposed to work for 400 years. So that's how she's running. And so the public defenders are saying, she gets it, but given what a district attorney does and what it is to be a district attorney, all she can do is kind of mitigate the harm of this whole system.
Yeah, it's sort of like trying to clean up after the mess a little bit.
And she really gets it, this woman, and there's another candidate who does as well. And these guys are saying, yeah, okay, she would be the best, but we're not going to endorse anybody, right?
Yeah, interesting. It's been interesting to watch here in Philly as Krasner has tried to follow through on his promises and he's done a lot of good things, but it's not like the system is fixed or something.
Yeah, what this ultimately boils down to is the district attorney and the police and all of these things are part of a system. These are interlocking parts that have to mesh with one another, and they have to mesh with the rest of the society. what Lenin is talking about, I think, really like dovetails with the kinds of issues we were dealing with in the last episode when we talked about Minneapolis, the Black Lives Matter, and we had the guests with us talking about that. There's a limit to how much you can reform the existing system, and ultimately, what you have to do is to break this state power and the whole administrative apparatus that's part of it. And what Lenin is saying is that power has to be in the hands of the people. I mean, he's continually in this pamphlet contrasting the standing army, a specialist standing army, of the state, which is supposedly separate from the people, over and above the people, supposedly representing all of the people, whereas in fact it's carrying out the wishes of one class over another class or other classes. Okay, you got all of that. What you have to have is the people policing themselves, the armed populace policing itself. I think this is just extremely relevant to the questions that the movement is facing, on a daily basis as we come up against the limits of reforming, moving monies away from the police and so forth. I mean, ultimately, it's either them or us. And I mean, this is not a new idea. I mean, people have talked about it, but in the current environment, I don't hear anybody really going there because, I mean, when you think about how threatening even to talk about defunding the police is or abolition of the police and shifting to more emphasis on services, when you think about how all of that is already just like so threatening, brings out such a counter reaction to talk about communities controlling themselves, that would be like that just way too radical for a lot of people in the current moment. But I mean, you have to have some regulation of behavior because there's all kinds of wackos out there, right? You got spousal abuse, you have people murdering their friends and so forth. You got all of that stuff, and you're always going to have that, and societies have always like regulated themselves and kept people from getting too far out of line. You got to have that, but you don't need a state to do it. You don't need a special force that's supposedly over and above society to do it. The society itself can do it, and the people can do it. But now we're not talking about the capitalist state, right? And so it's a big lift, yeah.
So I feel like the first time I read State and Revolution, probably like 20 years ago, I yawned through the extensive quoting of Marx and Engels. When I read it now, I totally understand what's going on here.
Which is what?
Well, Lenin isn't just trying to make an argument about the nature of the state and how revolutionaries should approach the state, but he's also trying to make an argument about reformism and the practices of these sort of opportunists, as he regards them in the social democratic organizations, who have done something very slippery and dangerous with Marx, that is to define where left ends with their position. There's nothing to the left of their position. That's because they take Marx and to reinterpret Marx to paint themselves as the inheritors of his tradition. And they, after doing that, sort of cancel out what he was actually saying about revolution and the state. So Lenin needs to go back through Marx and Engels and say, look, Marx wasn't saying that you just run for parliament and the state gradually withers away through a process of gradual reforms over time. Marx is saying you have to take over the state machinery, smash the state, suppress the power of the capitalist class, create something new. And so he goes through, and because people have been misappropriating these works of Marx and Engels and quoting them out of context, he needs to go through the text and say and explain what the people have gotten wrong.
Right. In particular, because there's a terminological imprecision. Really has to do a lot of work because you got Engels saying, there won't be a state, and then you have Marx referring to the state under communism, And what Lenin is able to show is, and he says this at one point, he says, look, there's no difference in views between Marx and Engels here. It's just terminology. When you read it in context, they're saying the same thing. And when Marx talks about the state, he at one point in the critique of the Gotha program, he says the state, or whatever you want to call it, some body that would perform functions similar to those that the current state performs. So it's clear that it's not a state, but it would be the socialist analog to certain functions of the state that exist in capitalism. So I thought Lenin did a very good job. And you can only do that by a detailed and painstaking, very deliberate discussion of how the term state is used in this passage and that passage, what it refers to here, what it refers to there.
Well, Andrew, you're not a stranger to this type of writing.
No, I'm not, and I'm sure a lot of people get bored, and I'm sure a lot of people are like, oh, this is just dogmatism and doctrinaire. But I mean, when you look at it, look at how much Lenin is able to accomplish by very careful reading, and look how much he's able to communicate about what he's learned through careful reading by displaying that to the readers and taking them through it. I think it's just a masterpiece in that respect. Most people think, okay, the way to be some great intellectual is to be original, and so people try to cover over the sources of their thinking, as if no idea it merits anything, and it can't be said to be your thinking if there's any historical antecedents to it, and that is literally nuts. There is no new thought that just emerges full blown from nothing. I mean, something always comes out of something, not out of nothing. And here you've got in the State and Revolution something coming out of something, and Lenin doesn't disguise that. And I think that I think it's a very productive method. I employ it. I know people don't like it, but I also think, it's like you were saying, it's the only way to get at, like, if we want to understand, okay, Marx, and we want to understand, Marx's theory of the state, not just in itself, but how it relates to the totality of his thinking. If we want to try to grasp what this guy's thinking was as a whole, and not just this bit and that bit, but we really want to, like, get into his head, so to speak. This is the way you have to do it. Otherwise, you're just like in a junkyard and scavenging, picking up this door handle and that part of a carburetor and stuff, and it's just not as good. Treating other people's ideas with respect and being very patient and careful with them, that is the way to go, because thought builds on thought. It doesn't just spring from out of nothing.
So we alluded to the fact that we're going to talk about the way Lenin discusses economic questions earlier in the interview. So let's get into some of that. A lot of State and Revolution is about political questions, but he does get into some economic stuff. In particular, he deals with the difference between capitalism and communism, as well as the move from capitalism to what Marx called the initial phase of communism, and Lenin often calls socialism, and the further development of communist society into a higher phase. So how is all that related to his main argument about the state?
I mean, first of all, you don't have either state or economy existing on its own. You've got a certain form of economy, you've got a certain form of politics, and you have to understand what's the relationship between the two. Communism is understood as a society with a communist mode of production, that's the economy, but one in which there is no state. So that's the politics of it. There is no state. So why is there no state? And I mean, Lenin draws out what's in Marx and Engels, is that there is no state because, since the state is a repressive apparatus, keeping down subordinate classes to keep the ruling classes in power, when you have a classless society, which is what communist society is, everybody is just part of the people. Everybody is, a worker, unless like tired or can't work or something. You've got a classless society. There's no functions anymore for the state in that repressive sense to perform. There are no subordinate classes, therefore no subordinate classes to keep down, therefore no need for a state. So this is all being rearticulated by Lenin, this relationship between the form of economy, classless society, classless economy, and the politics. Um, but it's more complex than that because we've got the period of the seizure of political power. What is its character? Marx refers to that as the dictatorship of the proletariat. You can understand the meaning of dictatorship better by reading Lenin here. It's not that it's undemocratic, but that it's every form of state is a dictatorship in the sense that the function of the state is to maintain the power of the ruling classes over the subordinate classes. So it's a dictatorship of the ruling classes over the subordinate classes. So you would still have that, right? Marx is thinking prior to the first phase of communist society, when you've gotten rid of the political rule of capital, and you're trying to establish the initial phase of communism, in other words, socialism. Then what happens in the initial phase of communism, and then what happens in the higher phase of communism. And so Lenin is trying to say, look, in the lower phase of communism, you still don't have a situation where people can take everything without regard to what they contribute. In the higher phase of communism, it would be people contributing without regard to what they receive, and receiving without regard to what they contribute. That's the meaning of from each according to their abilities, each according to their needs. But in the lower phase of communism, we're definitely not there yet. So there's got to be some link between what you contribute and what you receive, and you need regulate that. So in that sense of state, the public regulation of how much people contribute, how much an individual contributes, how much they receive, you're still going to need that kind of thing. And so Lenin works that out. So a lot of what he says here, I'm happy with, but not everything.
So in the period of transition before the lower phase of communism, there's a need for the dictatorship of the proletariat in order to smash the power of the bourgeoisie and assure the survival of the revolution, etc. Then we have the lower phase of communism, in which there are certain administrative functions that are still necessary, that have sort of an analog maybe to state functions. And then there's the higher phase of communism, in which even those functions start to wither away, become less necessary. So what do you think about Lenin's treatment of the difference between capitalism and communism, and the move from capitalism to communism?
I think it's seriously flawed, and to prepare for doing this episode, I looked again very carefully at the text at this point, and it's very tricky because he doesn't say anything outright that I think is wrong, and he doesn't say anything that explicitly contradicts what Marx is saying. But the way it's written is such that I'm not sure that he gets it. I'm not sure that he was thinking the same way, for instance, that Marx was. And there's also a confusion having to do with the language that he uses. Marx says there's the period of the revolutionary transformation of capitalism into communism. There's a period of revolutionary transformation, and he says to this corresponds a political transition period in which the state can't be anything other than the dictatorship of the proletariat. Lenin refers to a transition from capitalism to communism. And I think Lenin is pretty clear that the lower phase of communism is a communist society without classes and without a state in the proper sense. I think he's pretty clear on that. But there are passages in which he seems to be indicating that there is a repressive state apparatus in the lower phase of communism. And the problem is because he is not really clear in the way he refers to this, that has given rise over the decades to a theory that is like just the opposite of Marx's, a conception of the new society, the opposite of Marx's, in which, first of all, the lower phase of communism isn't communism because it's some supposedly other thing called socialism. And it's not just a matter of terminology. This is not a classless society. It's a transitional society in which you got this repression of the capitalists by the working class. So you got like capitalism still in existence, and supposedly you're somehow moving to communism, but you've got a repressive state apparatus, you've got classes still in existence, and yet you're calling it a socialist society. I mean, that's just completely not what Marx was talking about. And let me just find you like, okay, so this is in Lenin's discussion, the section called The Higher Phase of Communist Society. He says, until the quote higher phase of communism arrives, the socialists demand the strictest control by society and by the state over the measure of labor and the measure of consumption. But this control must start with the expropriation of the capitalists, with the establishment of workers' control over the capitalists, and must be exercised not by a state of bureaucrats, but by a state of armed workers.
So that sort of seems to like conflate together a transitional period of revolutionary violence or force with the lower phase of communism.
Bingo. That's exactly the point. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know that this is what he meant. It would be hard to think that this is what he meant because he says the opposite kind of elsewhere in the text. But the only way of not reading it that way is if he's just conflating two different things. And the real upshot of that is to put off to the very distant future a real classless society, and what we're really for, by saying we've got a state and we've got all of this strict control over people in the lower phase of communism, the only way to understand Lenin not to be saying that is to put very heavy emphasis on the word start. Until the higher phase arrives, blah, 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 blah. But this control must start with the expropriation of the capitalists, with the establishment of workers' control. I mean, you could argue that he's saying, okay.
Yeah, I see it.
Yeah, what we got to do is start with this control, and expropriates capitalists, establishes workers' control. Then we can have a classless society, but we still need some of these control functions. That is not how Lenin has been understood. Okay, I think that is probably what he meant, but it's so poorly written, and this has given rise to basically continuing with capitalism with some promise there's going to be a better future, which that gets called the Transitional Society, and that's like become the goal of all these people who call themselves socialists. They just want to take control of the existing economy and existing state apparatus, and have them run it instead of the other people. And that's somehow socialism because they have some social democratic programs, or they've got public ownership, state ownership, but classless society, no.
Hey, we're going to return to this conversation in just a moment, but first, as we do in every episode, we're going to take just a few minutes to hear from Anja Clark, Organizational Secretary of Marxist-Humanist Initiative, the organization which sponsors this podcast.
Marxist-Humanist Initiative, or MHI, aims to contribute to the transformation of this capitalist world by projecting, developing, and concretizing the philosophy of Karl Marx and its further development in the Marxist humanism articulated by Raya Dunayevskaya. The ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and today's many other social, political, and economic crises make this a moment to engage people in discussion of these ideas. In the U.S., we are faced faced with the threat of Trumpism triumphing and all-out authoritarianism extinguishing our right to carry on these discussions. Yet at the same moment, the multiracial movement for Black lives has spread to every corner of the country and the world, launching a flood of activism and new ideas that deepen the concept of freedom. MHI is dedicated to the task of proving theoretically that an alternative to capitalism is possible. We are distinguished by our economic analyses, in which we do not merely assert but demonstrate that the only opposite to the current world economic system is its abolition and replacement with one not based on the production of, quote, value, close quote. Because capitalism cannot be fundamentally reformed, attempts to reform it lead to an intensification of state capitalism, not to socialism. We are not a political party, nor are we trying to lead the masses, who will form their own organization and whose emancipation must be their own act. But we have seen that spontaneous actions alone are insufficient to usher in a new society. We seek a new unity of philosophy and organization in which mass movements striving for freedom lay hold of Marxist philosophy of revolution and recreate society on its basis. Our ideas and actions, as well as our structure and rules, are guided by the interests of working people and freedom movements of people of color, LGBTQ people, other minorities, women, youth, and all those around the world who are struggling for self-determination in order to freely develop their own human natures. We have no interests separate and apart from theirs. To this end, we open our website to the widest possible dialogue with people around the world. We intend to practice as well as espouse a two-way road between our organization and people outside it, as essential to developing a single dialectic in the relationship of theory to practice, and as the way to assure the survival of Marxist-Humanism. Please join us.
So Lenin's putting all the stress on the need for workers to control the economy. And he stresses the need for the whole of the armed population, as he calls it, to directly participate and control over production and distribution. And he argues that
These are words that Brendan is quoting from the same section.
control over production and distribution is what he says. And he argues that, quote, accounting and control by the armed workers is, quote, mainly what is needed for the proper functioning of the first phase of communist society. So, I mean, this gets into some of your main criticism of Lenin here. What do you think about this accounting and control stuff?
I think it's nuts, frankly. I should say, I don't want to get into the whole thing, but the use of the term accounting and control kind of like shifted over the years after this. First of all, it's nuts to say that accounting and control is the main thing needed for the proper functioning, of an economy. When you think about economic problems, how often do you think of accounting problems?
Right.
Where do you read in the news about, like, oh, we've got all these economic problems because of bad accounting? No. The economic problems are elsewhere. But this is not just like some gratuitous, stupid thing that Lenin is saying. It's built on a certain understanding of the economy. And it's, in my view, a totally wrong understanding of the economy that leads him into this. Let me try to lay out what the economic theory is. Right. I'm going to read from The State and Revolution. He says, we, the workers, shall organize large-scale production on the basis of what capitalism has already created, backed up by the state power of the armed workers. A witty German social democrat, Lenin continues, of the 70s of the last century, that's the 1870s, called the Postal Service an example of the socialist economic system. This is very true. At the present, the Postal Service is a state capitalist monopoly, but the mechanism of social management is here already to hand. Once we have overthrown the capitalists, we shall have a splendidly equipped mechanism which can very well be set going by the united workers themselves, to organize the whole economy on the lines of the Postal Service, so that the technicians, foremen, and accountants, as well as all officials, shall receive salaries no higher than a, quote, workman's wage, all under the control and leadership of the armed proletariat. That is our immediate aim.
Well, so basically the problem is just taking over the administrative apparatus of the corporations or the capitalist enterprises.
Combining them into one big super monopoly, okay, further monopolizing everything. But the idea is, yeah, everything has become so monopolized so that it's already, in essence, in capitalism, organized in itself, and it's just a question of who's controlling it, not the way it's organized. So it's all really internally organized anyway, and all you need to do is further organize it, put all of the monopolies and oligopolies into one gigantic national trust and take it over.
So basically the forms themselves are neutral, and it's just a matter of taking them over and paying people workmen's wages.
That's it. He talks about a mechanism. The conception is that the economic forms are neutral, and therefore they just need to be taken over, because the capitalists use them in one way, we can use them in a different way. They have no inherent class character. There's no inherent class character to capitalist monopoly. What's the weirdest, and I keep trying to get my head around that, what's the weirdest part is, here is a man recovering after decades the Marxist theory of the state, saying that the state is not neutral. It's an instrument of repression. It has to not be taken over. It has to be broken. And when it comes to the economy, oh, well, that's neutral. Okay? That just needs to be taken over. The purpose of production seems to have nothing to do with the way production is organized. It's mind-boggling, the gap there. Okay, but Lenin did not make up this view of capitalism having already abolished competition, and they thought that competition was the sine qua non of capitalism. Capitalism is already abolishing competition, therefore it's already morphing into socialism, and on its own it's therefore kind of building socialism, but it's not explicit because there's still private property and ownership, so we just need to take it over. That was the theory. And it leads to such absurdities as socialism is the postal service. I always say, Lenin was not familiar with the phrase going postal. Work relations in the post office were not the speed up and all that was obviously not so terrible back then as it has been in the United States in recent decades. The fact that workers go postal has to do with the speed up. And that is just one thing that should just tell us no, even when it's public or quasi-governmental, the capitalist priorities of producing the maximum and paying the workers the minimum. The post office is capitalist. It's built along capitalist lines, and there's nothing neutral about this. But even apart from that, this whole idea that an economy can be thought of as a company, and that the ways in which one manages a single company are the ways that one can manage an economy, by accounting and control. I find that mind-boggling and just incredibly naive. You have to deal with issues of incentives. You have to deal with issues of coordination. I mean, even if you have one gigantic monopoly, you've got things produced in one place that are inputs, supplies for something produced elsewhere, and there's a tremendous coordination issue, and you can't just manage this by accounting. There are decisions, there are trade-offs. There are incentives, there are priorities, and so it's not just a matter of crunching numbers.
Yeah, when the Bolsheviks ran into some serious coordination problems early on anyway.
Yeah, they had tremendous economic disruption because the supplies were being kept from them. They were being hoarded, they were being destroyed, and so forth in the midst of the Civil War.
So anyway, we can't do a whole history of the Bolsheviks and the their economic coordination problems as their thinking evolved along different lines. But I mean, would you? It seems like you're suggesting, though, that this naivete about the ease of coordinating economic relations along non-capitalist lines was maybe a contributing factor to some of the problems they encountered?
I don't know if it was a contributing factor directly. What I know is that they didn't see it coming, and so they were not prepared for what to do. If you had a different mindset, you would say there are all these different sites of production, and there needs to be coordination of them. And you wouldn't immediately turn to the issue of, okay, well, we just suppress the capitalists and that solves the problem. Because it doesn't. You would think about the issue in an entirely different way. I mean, yes, they were facing sabotage and all kinds of problems during the Civil War, but even thereafter, they faced tremendous issues of coordination that they had not understood at all. And yeah, and they never really got control during Lenin's life. They never got any real control over the economy. But I mean, it's like, how can somebody understand that you need to smash the state without understanding that you need to smash capitalist production, capitalist priorities, the self-expansion of value as the motive force, and that the existing economy is all built around that. If you understand that you can't just take over the state, what is preventing somebody like Lenin from understanding you can't just take over the capitalist economy? It's this idea based on a superficial, I think, reading of Marx. It's stuff that he kind of said that capitalism is abolishing competition. And this is the socialization of the capitalist mode of production within the capitalist mode of production itself. Yeah, that all comes from Marx. But the error comes when they begin to think that what is characteristically capitalist, what's the defining feature of capitalism, is competition, so that this monopolization is in some sense really socialism instead of a harbinger of a different socialist future. This idea that by getting rid of competition, so-called, in the form of monopoly, which doesn't really get rid of competition, and Lenin knew that, but that was the social democratic conception. That was like Hilferding's conception, is capitalism is transforming by itself into its opposite, and so all we need to do is take over. That's the core of the problem here. This theory that Lenin inherited, that he just kind of takes for granted as the basis for his stuff about, all kinds of good stuff about the armed workers taking over, and so what you then get with people like the Council Communists is, well, these people really don't have the workers taking over, and the way they do accounting and control, Jan Appel, is not on the basis of strict accounting, on the basis of average labor time, but it's all disputes on the same conceptual foundation without any real understanding of what real economic problems are, how they differ from accounting problems, how you're not dealing with the issues of what really needs to be changed to break from capitalism by means of accounting. You're just begging all the real questions. But, Jan Appel doesn't see it, and so many people have not seen it because they either are just not aware of these issues because they never have really thought about what an economy is, or they've read Hilferding and the other people that Lenin read, and they think that you just take over this foundation that the capitalism is already built, and socialism is one gigantic postal service.
And Andrew, if people wanted to read anything you have written about this topic, what would they look at?
I've got a new article. Actually, it's based on something I wrote 15 years ago, but I've got a new article in with Sober Senses that's largely about this.
And that article is called "Why No Call to Smash Capitalist Production in Lenin's State and Revolution." You can find that on Marxist-Humanist Initiative.org. Hey, that's all the time we have for this episode of Radio Free Humanity. If you like the podcast, please do stop by Marxist-Humanist-Initiative.org to listen to other episodes and to read more about these issues and others. As always, if you like the podcast, we encourage you to write to us, to comment and rate the podcast, and of course to share with all your friends and enemies.